Libby, you're back. Where did you go?
Back! Yay! Yes. Let me give you some options here. I know you like tests, Scott. So let's make it a
Great.
multiple choice test.
Every show is
see-
going to start with a test
Yeah,
now.
can you guess where I was? Option number 1, I was at an intensive jujitsu seminar to learn how to armbar politicians into answering my questions finally.
It's very you.
I was number 2, option 2. I was on a secret mission to that petting zoo in Montana to rescue
Oh my
Sugar,
God.
the escaped North Bend zebra.
Also very you.
Third option, I was getting my blimp pilot degree because you got to have a backup career for when Trump finally defunds NPR.
You're going to do a Hindenburg too.
No, Scott, actually, I was on a thing called a vacation.
What?
I was in Japan, traveling, enjoying myself, thinking I was getting
Tell
away
me it
from
was
politics.
terrible.
Yeah,
Tell me it was terrible.
It was horrible and delightful, and everything I ate was amazing. And everywhere I went, people were asking me about Trump.
Oh, great. Well, this week our show is going to go somewhere even more exciting, if you can believe it. Governor Jay Inslee's office.
My God.
It's time for Sound Politics.
Somebody stole the governor's chair.
Oh.
Where's the governor's chair? Oh, there it is. I've already been deposed.
Welcome to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann, and we're not going to the governor's office. This week, our colleague, Jeanie Lindsay, is going to take over the show. She had an extensive sit-down with Governor Jay Inslee as he prepares to head out the door.
He has been in office 12 years, longer than any currently serving governor in the country. So much has changed since 2012 in climate policy, economic growth, homelessness, crime. But how does Jay Inslee want to be remembered?
Here's Jeanie.
All right, so I'm here with the outgoing governor of Washington, Jay Inslee. Governor, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
So we'll talk about your 12 years in office in a minute, but as you prepare to leave office, you're meeting with people, you're doing interviews like this, walking through these marble halls, what's going through your mind most often?
Where to put all of this stuff I have accumulated that is now in my desk and on my walls. How am I going to get it into my basement? How about that for the, no, I've tried to run through the tape here, and I'm still working on a daily basis on things that we want to keep moving forward on, and our mental health and our juvenile rehabilitation improvements we're making. And I just rolled out a budget proposal that I was statutorily required to propose. So I've been working on things, like I've said, running through the tape, really as an executive, and that's what I've been doing. As far as the number one, I feel good about the successor. I think we're going to have a good governor. I think we're going to have a good attorney general. I think they're going to stand up to Donald Trump and do a good job. And I feel good about the progress we've made in the state of Washington over the last 12 years, and I'm reasonably confident that that's going to continue. And I'm very proud of our state. I really loved Washington when I started. I love her more going out because I've seen the tremendous progress that our state can make, which is really leading the country and the world in so many different veins. So what I'm thinking is it's been a very satisfying 12 years and a very productive 12 years for the state of Washington. And I want to credit everybody for that.
Yeah, and speaking of the next legislative session, sort of gearing up for the upcoming year, there are a lot of pressing issues for the state that you just talked about that are going to remain top of mind for a lot of people: housing, budget stuff, behavioral health, etc. But I wanted to ask, what do you think is the one most pressing issue facing the state right now that you see emerging right now that is really going to need more attention and action in the upcoming year or several years?
Well, the overriding challenge is how are we going to maintain the forward-looking momentum of the state of Washington? We believe people should have mental health treatment. We believe we've got to reduce homelessness. We believe we've got to provide special education for our students. We want to continue that progress. We do not want to go backwards. This is not a state that ever goes backwards. So we don't want to slash the projects that we now are bearing fruit to increase capacity in our juvenile justice system, to get more mental health treatment for teenagers, to get more help and counselors into schools. We just don't want to go backwards on those things. So all of those things have one thing in common. You have to have a way to finance these services for Washingtonians. And right now there's about a $16 billion 4-year budget hole that has to get fixed. And that's going to be the overriding challenge for the legislature this year. My budget did about $2 billion of cuts. We did find some things that we could remove from our budget. But we're going to have some additional revenues to keep the progress that has been so satisfactory over the last 12 years. So that'll be the number one challenge for legislators.
Yeah, and speaking of that, my first bucket of questions for you is about taxes. So, exciting start. So yeah, speaking of the budget deficit, your wealth tax proposal, which is it's a 1% tax on people with more than $100 million in assets, and it would cover a big bulk of this deficit, this gap. But it seems like this gap's existence, is also speaking at least in part to sort of a fundamental issue with the state's tax code. It's reliant on sort of these boom and bust revenue cycles and sources like sales tax, capital gains tax, property tax. So kind of stepping back from this and talking about that, do you think that Democrats and Republicans can get together to make our state's tax system less volatile? And if so, how do you see that working?
Well, I actually don't believe volatility in the tax system is the reason for the challenge we now have. The reason we have a challenge now is very, very rapid increase in caseloads. The number of people who don't have food has skyrocketed. The number of people going into food banks for the first time has gone up 33% in just like a year. The number of people, young people who have behavioral health needs has skyrocketed. The number of kids who have been involved in criminal activity that are coming into our juvenile justice system has skyrocketed. Plus, we've been having inflation, like many other businesses and the like, and we've had a reduction in revenues, which is not dramatic, but has occurred, a reduction in the rate of increase. So I believe those are actually the fundamental economic reasons that our state is in this situation. Now, the question is whether you can get a consensus between the parties. That'll be very difficult, because one party is happy to cut behavioral health services for teenagers. My party is not. They're happy to cut services for those people who are homeless. My party is not. They're happy to take away health care from women who want to exercise the right of choice. Our party is not. So there are some fundamental disagreements about this. And the answer from Brand X party is always, well, just go slash and burn. But when it gets right down to reality, these are real people that aren't going to have food, aren't going to have housing, and aren't going to have medical care. And we find that unacceptable. So we think there's a better way, and I've proposed a way not to put that burden on working people, which we should not do, because our tax system has been very unfair to working people for 130 years, putting a disproportionate burden on working people rather than those with extreme wealth. People at the lower end of the spectrum pay 6 times more as a percentage of their income than the top 20%. So we felt if we have to raise revenues that we should try to avoid putting more tax burden on working people. And that's why we made the proposal that we did. It's a very modest proposal. It's 1%, only on assets over $100 million. That's not going to change anybody's lifestyle, and those fortunes will continue to grow at 4% at least, even after a 1% tax. It's a very modest proposal, and we think there's a way it needs to be very acutely crafted to make sure it doesn't include assets that you can't value. We don't want to start startups from starting. That's why we set the bar at $100 million that is free of any tax. So it's a proposal to suggest legislators, A, we need to keep the progress going in the state of Washington, and we don't want to put the burden on lower income people, and this is a way to do it.
So I want to move into a conversation about party representation and some of the dynamic shifts in Olympia that have happened while you've been governor. The Washington legislature has been controlled by Democrats since 2018, when Democrats took back the Senate. And the state did move a little bit redder in the presidential election this year, but it's a solidly blue state. Democrats
less than any other state
right.
in the United States. Let's be proud of that.
Yeah. And so the state is solidly blue. I mean, we have all Democrats at statewide elected positions. Every Democrat that ran for re-election won. But the complaint from Republicans is that conservative Washingtonians have a limited voice in state government. And we sort of saw that come into play with these initiatives from Let's Go Washington that made it on the ballot this year. Those initiatives mostly failed, but they did show frustrations with Democrats in Olympia. And I'm wondering, did Democrats need to do a better job of reaching out to conservative voters?
So I'm not sure I understand your question. Maybe you weren't looking at the voting results that I am. But voters voted by a 62 to 38 margin in favor of the climate change action. That is enormous vindication of what we're doing, Democrats are doing in the state of Washington. They voted by overwhelming margins, over 60%, to maintain the capital gains tax. That was an overwhelming vindication of huge majorities in Washington state believe we were going in the right direction. They voted overwhelmingly to support the long-term care plan. This was a massive vindication of the policies that Democratic parties and myself have been advocating by tidal wave margins. These are not narrow margins. So I'm not sure I understand your question. It showed to me a huge support for the direction of the state of Washington. And I do not understand Republican whining about saying they don't have a voice. They got the same voice I did. They got one vote, and every single person got the same vote. And they're entitled to be in newspapers and blog posts just as much as anybody else. So, and their legislators get to make arguments on the floor of the House and Senate. So I don't understand that. They don't win all the time, and I'm sure that's frustrating to them. But nobody guarantees you the right to win in a democracy. They give you a right to vote and to speak, and our Republicans have the right to do both big time, and they do it, and we counted the votes. Now, the unfortunate part of the Republican Party is they don't want to follow the votes. They don't like that. They still say that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. They are supportive of an insurrectionist who countenanced an insurrection on January 6th and tried to get the Secretary of State in Georgia to give him falsified 11,000 votes. So they're still under the sway of Donald Trump. I think that's most unfortunate. They still refuse to admit that I'm governor. I mean, the guy I ran against still think he won, even though I won by 500,000 votes. So I don't understand that. I mean, I can understand their frustration, but I do not accept their comment that somehow they're shut out of the political process. They're tremendous participants in the political process, but you just don't get to win all the time in life or in democracy.
I guess the core of the question that I'm trying to ask is more about making sure that Washington's government is, for all of the people, even those who didn't vote for Democrats. So I guess I'm just wondering, do Democrats need to do anything more to get more conservative voices at the table? Or it sounds like you're saying no.
Well, let me give you an example of this. So the Republicans are totally deny climate change. They don't understand how forest fires are ravaging our state because of climate change. So when we've had giant forest fires in our state, what has happened? Well, when a small town in eastern Washington called Malden burned to the ground in a fire, what happened? Did I say, well, I'm not going to help that community because they're 80% or 70% Trump supporters? Heavens no. I did everything I could to help these people. And when I went to visit with them, the whole town was full of Trump signs. But that did not dissuade me from trying to help these folks because they needed my help. And I tried to help them as much as I could. What did Donald Trump do? He refused to provide emergency assistance to this small town. And now I don't just make up that story. The Republican congresswoman for Spokane confirmed that in a letter saying, don't punish Washington just because you don't like Jay Inslee. You got to help these people. So I think I've demonstrated a desire to help people no matter who they voted for or what their ideology is, to help them and to follow my public responsibility. You can't say that for Donald Trump, who willfully, this is amazing to me that an American president would refuse to come to the aid of people who've had their town burned down. And that's exactly what he did. So I am very committed to help Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Libertarians, anarchists in any way I can, and I've demonstrated that. And to listen to them. We've had a very transparent government and administration, I think. in a very open one. In fact, I was given an award by the Newspaper Association for respecting transparency so that people know what we are doing. So I love all Washingtonians, and I want to work for them, and then they get to vote.
So I want to move on into public safety.
By the way, I should note that I spent 20 years living in a red district, too, and represented a red district for 6 years, won 3 out of 4 elections in a red district. So there's something to be said for that experience, because I was in the Yakima Valley for 20 years with my wife, raising our 3 kids, and we loved every day of it.
Right. So moving on into public safety and talking a little bit about the Blake decision. So in 2021, the state Supreme Court struck down Washington's felony drug possession law. You called lawmakers to a special session in 2023 so they could come up with a more permanent answer to that after they failed to pass one during the regular session that year. Drug possession is now a gross misdemeanor, but organizations and some advocates like the ACLU have said that arresting people for drug possession isn't the right answer. Do you believe that the Blake fix that lawmakers passed in 23 found the right balance between enforcement and treatment?
I'm not proposing changes in the Blake decision.
Well, I want to follow up on this because I remember this was called an imperfect solution. And I remember at the time nobody really could point to this and say, wow, all of my dreams on this issue have come true. We know that courts have been squeezed for resources. There's a shortage of public defenders. Treatment infrastructure is being built, but that takes time. So I'm wondering, I guess, what you see as the next step here, or something that should or could be addressed now as we're waiting for some of these longer things to come online.
Well, I've tried to do my part to help, and that is to propose a budget that would preserve the financial resources to provide drug treatment, to provide therapy for people trying to break these very harmful habits. And that's the part that I can play at this moment as an exiting governor, to propose a budget that will preserve the dollars to help people be able to get this treatment, which is ultimately the solution rather than incarceration. We know that incarceration isn't going to solve the problem. We know that treatment can and does frequently for people. So I've done what I can do is to make sure we can keep that treatment option available to people, as well as increase our juvenile justice system to deal with the huge infusion of youthful crime. So I'm doing what I can to make sure those assets are preserved. And again, this goes back to some of my tax proposals to make sure we can be able to do these things. We need to understand that we need not just superficial, facial discussion of the policies. We need to have the resources to actually do this work. And that's what I've been focused on.
So in the aftermath of COVID, crime went up. It's gone down some by some metrics, but crime among young people, as you said, is up right now. So what do you see as the core contributors there? And how can the state address the root of that problem more effectively?
Well, let me address the second part of that. We should have an effort to prevent the fact that we have so many kids living in poverty and homelessness and lack of opportunity and poor educational opportunities early in life. So that's what we're doing. We're increasing we've increased dramatically our access to early education, child education, and child care opportunities for our students. We've increased dramatically the opportunity for kids to get psychological counseling and nursing in our schools by the hundreds of millions of dollars. We have increased the access to health care through Obamacare and the like that we want to preserve, that the Republicans continue to try to take away. So we're trying to provide a safety net that gives kids the infrastructure to stay out of trouble in the first place. We've provided the best financial aid package in the United States so that we can try to encourage more students to go into a college if they desire to do so. And importantly, we've created one of, if not the best, apprenticeship programs in the United States. So kids can get into a trade and an apprenticeship, those who don't have a college future in mind. So we have been very active in trying to build a system to provide protection so that young people don't go down the criminal path. But we've got some real challenges, one of which is guns, which we are swamped by an epidemic of guns in our society, where young people are carrying guns, and everything that used to be a fist fight is now a shooting of a 15-year-old shooting one of their classmates. And my heart bleeds for that. And somehow we've got to reduce the presence of guns in every pocket of every kid. And that's why I've been as aggressive as possible in gun safety measures and adopting gun owner responsibility laws and banning assault weapons and in the Brady Bill and safe storage and the like. Because the presence of guns is causing a horrific increase in violent crime. Again, these are kids who, again, they would have been a fist fight in 1969 when I was a senior in high school. Now they're shooting. So there's a combination of things we need to do. I don't have a silver panacea to this, but I hope we continue to help as much as we can. But again, I want to come back to this. Without revenues for the state of Washington, none of this is going to be possible. And unless people support legislators to stand up and make these things possible, they're not going to get done. And so that's going to be the big subject in the legislature this year.
So I want to move on to the pandemic. I'm contextualizing this by you've been governor through a number of emergencies, the Oso landslide in 2014, extreme fire seasons in multiple years, and then through all of it, there was the pandemic. I wanted to ask, what do you remember most about that emergent time in the pandemic as one of the first governors to be on the front lines of this health crisis that ultimately reshaped a lot of our country?
There's so many things that come to mind on that. I think the overriding moment or decision was, what are we going to put first in our multiple decision making? What value do we think is most important in all of these challenges? And I made a decision early on to say the preservation of life for Washingtonians was going to be our guiding light. That was going to be the value that we thought was the highest priority. And the reason is, without life, you haven't got much. So I remember early making a decision, we are going to follow science, number one, wherever it may lead, and we're going to make decisions based on saving people's lives. And we made that decision fairly early in the pandemic to follow science and save people's lives. And that bore great fruit because we kept our fatality rate very low, one of the lowest in the nation. And we saved thousands of people's lives in the state of Washington because we followed those two principles. And I don't just make that up. If we'd had the same fatality rate as Mississippi, we would have lost another 18,000 people in the state of Washington. So I think that the sort of early concept or belief that I had, follow science, save lives, really paid fruit. That people are going to go to their Christmas holidays this December there'd be an empty chair there, 18,000 empty chairs had we not done those two things. So that was the thing that I would think most. Now, the other is to try to figure out how to get Washingtonians to simultaneously recognize the level of the threat and give them confidence that we can do things to get through it together. And doing those both at the same time is a bit of an art form because you want people to understand the nature, how dangerous this was, while also giving people the confidence that if we work together and we follow science, we're going to get through this together. And so finding the way to talk in those terms was something that I tried to meet.
During the pandemic, there were certainly a lot of differences of opinions about how the state should tackle it. It stirred a lot of divisions. You declared a state of emergency that lasted over 2.5 years. The state was sued over some of your proclamations numerous times. Republicans criticized the length of the emergency order, calling it undemocratic. There's also some data now about how school closures impacted student learning while not necessarily being as effective in slowing the spread compared to the lasting harms on kids' learning. Hindsight is 2020, no pun intended. But knowing what you know now, would you have done anything differently?
Well, I think fundamentally no, because again, we followed science and we tried to save lives. And if you follow those two precepts, which we did, in the grand scheme of things, I think we were on the beam. The one thing that I wish I'd been successful on is getting students back into the classroom earlier than they did. And I had frustrations because, frankly, the educational community wouldn't go. And unless you have teachers willing to go, and community members and parents who will bring their children, you can't make it happen. And I spent a couple months trying to build a consensus so that we would all agree to do that. Well, finally, I just said, we need to go back. These kids need to get back in school. And so I made a decision, issued an order, we're going back to school. And, I wish people had been more willing to go back earlier, but they weren't. And so I had to finally issue an order. And we went back to school, and that was good. And again, I can't feel great regret of saving 18,000 lives. You can flail me, you can criticize me till the cows come home, but I can't feel bad about saving a lot of people's lives. And this is a real thing. Look, we had a legislator here, Republican state senator, who refused to get vaccinated because he was listening to Donald Trump. He refused to get vaccinated. And when he got sick, then he wanted everybody to come rescue him. He died, and he left a grieving family. We had a state trooper who refused to get vaccinated and was very critical of me in a viral video, frankly. And we lost him, and his family lost him. It was a tragedy. So what I'm saying is this was not an abstraction. It was real people whose real lives were in jeopardy. And I would say that we as a state should be very proud of our mutual efforts. It wasn't just me. I was called upon to make decisions because I was governor that were very extraordinary. No other governor in state history has ever been in this kind of position before. And I made them with an intention to try to save lives, and so I can't regret that.
So you mentioned Trump, and that happens to be where I'm going next in my questions. So you were at odds with the first Trump administration over the COVID response, as you just said. I mean, you said in 2020 that President Trump's response was a failed one. You said he was downplaying the risk of the virus. Trump fired back, called you a snake, but overall, you were generally a very fierce critic of the Trump administration. And this did have some ramifications. For example, like you mentioned earlier, he ignored your request for federal disaster aid after wildfires in 2020. I'm wondering what your advice is to your successor on how to engage with the next Trump administration, and do you see any risk in being too combative with the President of the United States?
Listen, I stand by every single thing I said about Donald Trump. Every single thing I've said about him was entirely accurate. He willfully downplayed the COVID pandemic. He willfully made it more difficult for us to save lives in the state of Washington. He willfully tried to take away the rights of Washingtonians with his illegal Muslim ban and many other concepts. So I stand by every single thing that I've said about the damage he tried to do to the state of Washington. And I don't think we should back up or kiss his ring or take the knee. I think that's a mistake. If there's things he can do to help the state of Washington, we should work with him if in fact that happens. And if it happens, great. But I don't counsel people to take a knee to Donald Trump. Taking knees to potential tyrants eventually ends up in the loss of democracy, and I would not recommend going that way. And I'm very concerned about this. He's attacking the media right now, so they do not criticize him. That would be a mistake for the media to self-censor. It would be a mistake for our Attorney General to cave to illegal activity by the president, and I'm convinced Nick Brown will be a great Attorney General and will not do that. It would be a mistake for the governor to say, go ahead and take away our federal benefits and we won't say anything about it. No, we're not going to do that. And so I stand by what I did, and I continue to criticize him and will continue to criticize him as appropriate. And none of my criticisms have not been justified in my view. And if by chance he gets one right, which could still happen, we will say great, and we'll work with him to see to it to make that happen. I'm very concerned about his damage, his potential damage to our state right now. This tariff proposal of his would be so injurious to our economy. We're an export-oriented state, and setting off a trade war could grievously hurt our agricultural industry and a lot of our tech companies as well. I don't want to see that happen, and could also increase inflation by driving up costs in this regard. He remains a clear and present danger to this state, and I would counsel for us to be truthful and appropriately protective of our state.
And I wanted to just follow up on this. Was there anything during the first Trump administration, like where the state worked well with the president? Does anything come to mind where there was something that there was agreement upon or that you worked well with his administration? And if so, can that be replicated?
Give me a minute. Give me a long minute.
All right.
Well, listen, it's kind of interesting because the Trump administration, I actually don't give them a lot of personal credit for this, but the development of this vaccine was a miracle. And there was some role that the administration, that the federal government played in the development of the vaccine. So if you look back, you will see some people who worked in the federal government who did amazing things developing this vaccine. It was truly a medical miracle in that time frame. Nobody thought it could be done so quickly. So that was wonderful. I'm not sure he had a lot to do with it personally, but his administration, somebody in the federal government did. But then he turned around and jeopardized our ability to get people to take it by suggesting that you should take horse bleach or ivermectin or ultraviolet light or something. And I witnessed this. I witnessed people who died because they listened to that man. I know several people who died because they listened to him. That's hard to excuse, and I do not. So I don't want to see that replicated.
So my next bucket is climate. And my first question for you is about some of the actions you've taken on climate issues. The stuff that you've worked on, especially toward the last half of your time in office, have made a case for your nickname as the greenest governor, climate guy Jay Inslee. The Clean Energy Transformation Act, which mandates the state move to 100% clean electricity by 2045. The cap and trade system for major polluters is now in place and preserved after this most recent election. But at the same time, the Department of Commerce reported a record high of homelessness in the state through last summer. School districts are underfunded, according to the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and fully funding public education is the state's paramount constitutional duty. I'm wondering how your administration's focus on climate policy affected your ability to effectively tackle these other major issues affecting the state. Did climate take up too much space?
Absolutely not, because our Climate Commitment Act are helping solve all of those problems that you just indicated. So we're using the Climate Commitment Act to help financing of school districts to get air filtration systems and to improve their air conditioning and heating systems to be both more efficient and healthier for our students. It's helping them improve their transportation systems by getting electric buses. It's helping them by getting safe routes to school so kids can get to school in a safe route. So it's helping education. It's helping housing in the same way that it's providing some of the energy assistance programs for housing, including a utility credit of $200 for low-income people on their utility bills. So the Climate Commitment Act has helped many of the challenges that you just talked about. And that's one of the reasons, a significant reason, why voters overwhelmingly vindicated my leadership on this subject by disapproving of this initiative. It was a forthright, robust, and overwhelming support because this Climate Commitment Act is helping those in a significant way. And I will note that kids who are breathing forest fire smoke precipitated by climate change are very difficult to get them to focus on their math problems. All of these problems are exacerbated by climate change. We're getting more homeless people because their houses are burning down and now can't get their houses insured. This morning I just saw a map of the states where it's becoming much more difficult to get insurance because of the forest fires and the flooding events that we're being exposed to. We have concerns about that over Medical Lake right now, where homes burned down in the Medical Lake fire, about insurance. So I guess I'd point out that the pernicious danger of climate change affects our lives in so many ways. It is an educational issue, it is a health issue, it is an economic issue, and it's a survival issue. So that's why I'm really proud of our state to have been so forcefully made a statement. It's been very important for the rest of the world. I went to Uzbekistan to the International Climate Conference a couple weeks ago, and people were so hopeful hearing our story of a state that has moved forward and the public has accepted with such vigor. It was very inspiring to them. So we now have 24 states in the U.S. Climate Alliance that I've started. Our leadership is a light to the rest of the country and the world on this, and so I'm really proud of our state, of what they're doing for so many different reasons.
And Your successor in the governorship is someone who you've worked with for a long time, Attorney General Bob Ferguson. He's been the AG as long as you've been governor. But he has shown a bit of a different approach on certain issues. Climate policy hasn't necessarily been his top line. He hasn't talked about it as much as you have. And the example that comes to mind is when he's talked about the ferry system, a proposal that he shared on the campaign trail. He agreed with the take that even some Republicans have been pushing about, the state should be open to diesel ferries if that means getting new boats faster. So are you concerned at all that the state won't take as proactive as approach to climate policy under Governor Ferguson?
No, Bob is an outdoors person. He understands what we've got here, the most beautiful state in the nation. He climbs mountains with his son on his son's birthday, and I'm convinced that he understands we have a unique system here of natural beauty and health. So I'm convinced that he'll do good work on this. You need to listen to what he did say about the ferries, though, because I think it is misunderstood. He said, well, we could do diesel boats if they're faster. Well, the only problem is they're not faster, they're slower. We've had our ferry system evaluate this very carefully, and it turns out if we actually stopped the progress we're making on our electric boats and shifted to diesel, it would retard the ability to get boats in the water by a year or two, because you have to start the whole procurement process, the whole design process. So what he's saying is not unreasonable if it was faster, but unfortunately it's not, and I'm convinced that he will become convinced of that once we have a chance to. In fact, he said the other day, there's no reason to discount what our ferry system is saying. So I think all will be good. As far as him not talking about it as often as I do, nobody talks it as often as I do about it, so I wouldn't hold this against him.
Is there somebody in Olympia that you see as sort of the new climate person to take up the mantle that sort of you're leaving as you leave office?
Well, we got a lot of great legislators on this. Joe Wynn in the House, or in the Senate. Joe Fitzgibbons in the House. Beth Doble's done tremendous. We've got a lot of leadership. I don't think we're going to lack for leadership on this subject. And again, I think what's most important is the public has spoken on this. This should not be a matter of debate. The public has said, we want clean energy. We want to defeat climate change. We want to help our constituents. That's not under debate anymore because we just run 60-38 on that issue. This was actually the one place in the United States where climate was on the ballot directly in the United States. And because people have spoken so forcefully on this, we shouldn't be having this argument. We should be figuring out how do we go faster.
So my last set of questions for you are sort of about legacy, your departing thoughts. As you leave office, what advice do you have for Governor-elect Ferguson?
Well, I was asked at a DJ event the other day, and I said, my advice is just take the former governor's calls once in a while. How's that for a request and advice? Well, my advice would be to understand every day what an incredible honor it is to serve as governor. And it is. And no matter how frustrating the challenges are, no matter how hard they are, just realize to be able to help so many people is a unique thing in life. And I feel so happy to have helped along the way. I've got up every morning trying to figure out how I can help Washingtonians. That's a true fortunate thing to have in life. And my advice would be to treasure that. I've treasured it, and we haven't talked about some of these things, but I hope to leave you with them. I'm very proud of the progress our state has made in 12 years in so many different ways. The best financial aid package in the United States so our kids can afford college. One of the most aggressive apprenticeship programs for our kids who want a trade that doesn't involve college can get it. The best paid family leave policy, hands down, in the United States. Some of the best gun safety measures in the United States that I've helped lead on. The end of a death penalty that I was involved in that was controversial, but it was the right decision. The public option we have in health care and our long-term care bill that, again, was resoundingly adopted and supported by the voters. The first improvement in the regressive tax system in 150 years in the state of Washington with the capital gains tax, which, again, was overwhelmingly supported by Washington state voters. A COVID response that was saved more lives maybe than any other state, or at least in the tops. Clean energy initiatives that have led to enormous economic creativity, diversity that is moving forwards for state equity for a state agency dedicated to that. Job creation that has been unparalleled. And this is interesting to me. You know what you get when you have a Democrat in the governor's office? We have been named the best place to do business in the United States and the best place to be a worker in the United States simultaneously by some of these rating bureaus. And so we have had tremendous progress in the last 12 years. And that's because we have Washingtonians who are confident in our ability to move forward, who have unparalleled innovative talents, who want everybody to thrive and don't want to leave people behind in society. And because I recognized those values in Washington, and there's a lot more work to do, but I'll tell you, being governor of the state of Washington has been a great job.
And I wanted to ask you this question. So like 50 years from now, when people are talking about Governor Jay Inslee, what's the top line? I guess, what do you think is your biggest, most lasting impact from your time in office?
Well, I can pretty much guarantee you that people won't be talking about Jay Inslee 50 years from now because life moves on and we move on to new adventures. But if they did, they would say the same thing about me as they would about any other 8 million of the Washingtonians, which is we responded to the effort to preserve the health of our state, to save ourselves from the ravages of climate change. Because of all the issues that we've talked about, nothing else can succeed if our forests all burn down, we don't have water to drink or to run our agricultural system, there's no salmon left in the Sound, and our kids can't breathe in August because of forest fires. Nothing else will matter. So I do believe 50 years from now, if people evaluated our generation of leadership, that's how we will be held to account as the thing that was most meaningful. Because if we don't solve that problem, nothing else matters. And I'm proud to say that our state has really been heroic in those efforts. And I'm glad to have played some role in that.
Okay, so my last big question, KUOW exclusive. Tell us what's next. Another run for president? A vacation in Idaho? I don't know.
I think a podcast through KUOW probably would be the funnest thing to do. So I do not have plans, except I do not intend to retire. I intend to work full time. I will be interested in what I can do to help advance this fight against climate change and developing clean energy jobs. And I'll try to figure out a way to use my experience and ideas in that direction. So a lot of people have come up to me and said, well, congratulations on your retirement. Well, I'm not retiring. I want to stay active and engaged in things I'm passionate about. So I'm looking forward to the next adventure, as is Trudy, and I thank Washingtonians for being able to serve. This is an unbelievable honor. I want to thank them.
Governor, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And that's it for Sound Politics today. Thank you to KUOW government reporter Jeanie Lindsay for that interview with Governor Inslee. Today's show was produced by Hans Anderson. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. And this show is only possible through donations from our listeners, like Reef. Thank you for your donation, Reef. If you want to join Reef, go to KUOW.org/politics to donate and keep our podcast and others like it going. And we also, as always, want to know your thoughts on the pod. Share your feedback or your questions at soundpolitics@KUOW.org or leave us a good old-fashioned voicemail at 206-221-0511. We're taking next week off to celebrate the holidays. We will be back in the new year. See you then.